Good morning, everyone. If we can be settled in our seats, we can begin with our conference. Okay. Dear honorable guests, we welcome you today to the third biennial Izmir University of Economics Gender Studies Conference. This year's conference will focus on many, many different topics. But above all, it is a conference about power and domination. It's a conference about law and legal rights, about politics and policy making, about the role of the state, about state priorities, about the role of culture and religion, about the effects of economic failure and economic distribution, corruption and the role of the media. Now, I can see on your faces, most of you are looking at me kind of wondering if you came to a gender violence conference or if you came to another event. Well, the reality is that this year's focus on gender violence is really a study of all of these different concepts. And all of these different topics, and they do not exist in isolation. And with this year's conference topic, we will address the many different manifestations of violence, ranging from domestic violence to homophobia, to its reflections in literature, media, and urban space. The basic idea to keep in mind is that violence is not just a women's issue, and that will be the key point that we will try to emphasize throughout the whole 3 days that we have. Let me introduce myself to you. My name is Itır Bağdadi, and I am a lecturer in the International Relations and the European Union Department of this very university. I am a member of the Gender and Women's Studies Research and Application Center, and I'm also one of the conference organizers, along with Burkay Pasin and Olga Selin Hünner, that you've probably written to personally throughout this whole academic conference organizing time period. So I'm very, very happy to see all of you here today, and we'll probably have more people coming in as the conference gets underway. We began planning for this conference well over a year ago when we made the initial call for proposals for an academic conference that would focus on gender violence, with a particular emphasis on body, space, and politics. We were pleasantly surprised at the amount of applications for the conference from many different countries around the world, making this event a truly international one. Today, we have panelists from places as far away as Taiwan and Canada, from Iran to Pakistan, and other non-academic participants from several African states. This diverse group of participants has given our conference more depth and coverage and a better platform for a more meaningful discussion. I would like to now begin our conference by inviting the rector of our university, Professor Dr. Tunçtan Baltacıoğlu, to give his opening remarks. Professor Baltacıoğlu.
Good morning, dear participants, colleagues, guests, and students. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the third Biennial Gender Violence International Conference. This conference, which organized by the Gender and the Women's Studies Research Center of Izmir University of Economics, brings researchers and activists from more than 50 different countries together. I believe this is an enormous chance to allow all the participants to share valuable research findings as well as to communicate their unique experience on violence toward gender. When used in daily language, violence usually refers to physical violence. However, we can use violence and get affected by it in so many different ways. It may happen in the form of unwanted sexual innuendo from a colleague, implicit threat in the public speech of a politician in the form of a newspaper article, or it might be embedded into a look forward a member of minority group. Very sadly, sometimes we could accept those violent remarks just as a simple act of a daily life and simply ignore the ideology of violence behind them. Today, I am grateful to the organizers of this conference to bring an opportunity for these distinguished researchers and activists to discuss the relationship between gender and violence thoroughly. According to the finding of a Turkish Bureau of Statistics, almost 42% of women in Turkey experienced physical and sexual violence through their lifetime. According to the World Health Organization, in the world, almost half of the women in the world were forced for their first sexual encounter. 70% of the female murder victims had been killed by their male partners. During the war of detention, rape became a method of control. Even though mass rape became a well-known war crime for the recent decades, the first documents of sexual violence went back to the War of Troy. In order to dominate, humiliate, and control both the victim and the community, rape and other sexual assaults have become a strategy of war. Spivak characterizes group rape perpetrated by the conquerors as a metonymic celebration of territorial acquisition. Examples of Bosnia, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and Liberia made rape disclosed in front of the international organization, institution, and public. Both male and female refugees of all age groups living in detention or detention-like settings are vulnerable for facing sexual violence. Children, especially the ones unaccompanied and in foster families, are under risk. Physical, psychological, and social consequences of these assaults are very detrimental on victims. When we are analyzing violence, we should pay a keen attention on the language reproduced by the media. Not only radical newspaper or TV channels, mainstream media may initiate hate speech about ethnic, cultural, or sexual minorities. Furthermore, reproduced hate discourse make those minorities extremely vulnerable to victimization by the masses. I thank you for all your patience and wish all of you a productive meeting. Thank you.
We thank our rector for his insightful remarks and his support of our center. Having the top management of our university present here today is very important for us, and it definitely shows how important this topic is also for our university as well. So, what I would like to do now is continue by giving you a brief background on our university's Gender Studies Center, which I will from now on refer to as the Turkish shortened version of EKOKAM. That's how we refer to ourselves, so I'll continue from now on by referring to us as EKOKAM. EKOKAM as a center became officially active in October 2009. However, its activities stretch much further back. Scholars at our university, primarily based in the Economics and Administrative Sciences faculty who were interested in gender studies, began to congregate and plan the first biennial conference on gender studies in 2006. So gender studies is not something that is new to this university. It has actually been around almost 5 years after its founding. So it's a very important topic for us, one that we continue to explore. I was among those group of scholars who began to ask gendered questions regarding issues that we normally took for granted. Now, the first biennial conference was held in 2007 when Turkey's accession to the European Union was underway and not stalled as it is today. And we wanted to analyze the exact impact such a membership would have on Turkish women and assess the impact it had on other states. Our keynote speaker at the time was Professor Sylvia Walby. For those of you studying social policy or for those of you studying patriarchy, so Sylvia Walby is a very, very well-known name, and we were very proud to have her here at our university. And the name of that conference was called The Effects of the European Union on the Socio-Economic Development of Women. Now, 2 years later, in 2009, we held our second biennial, this time focusing on positive action and what it meant for women. We asked the question, positive action empowering or disabling, in an effort to learn the pros and cons of what positive actions such as gender quotas brought to women and their struggle to achieve parity with men. Our keynote speech at the time was given by Professor J. Ann Tickner of the University of Southern California. And for those of you that are from the international relations discipline, such as myself, you will know her very well. She is the first female head of the International Studies Association. So after our second biennial conference, we felt the need to institutionalize our efforts, and we began work on formally establishing a gender studies center at our university. In 2009, there were approximately 15 such centers at different universities in Turkey, and we became either the 15th or the 16th such center that was established. Now, here I give an approximate number for the reason that gender studies centers began to mushroom all over Turkish universities. And so we don't know if we're the 15th or the 16th, but I can tell you that currently there are over 40 gender studies centers in all of Turkey at universities. I believe that just recently another one in Izmir at Izmir University was just established, so now we've got 41. From the first day of its founding, EKOKAM's main objective has been to raise awareness of gender issues, and we have done so by organizing 3 international academic conferences, that's including this one right here, and 8 seminars in various gender-related areas, ranging from the newly growing masculinity studies to human rights dimensions and the media, just to name a few areas of focus. In 2010, we held 4 such panels. In 2011, we held 2. And just in 2012 alone, year to date, we have had 2 events excluding this very conference. We will also have a seminar on hate crimes and homophobia, which will take place in May. Now, we've actively chosen to address issues that have both a national and an international dimension. And this conference fits in very well with the general aims of our center. The target audience for our conference is not only scholars, but those that actually work in the field, such as municipalities, health workers, security services, psychologists, sociologists, lawyers, state personnel, and religious leaders and students. We also aim to increase interaction among these groups to increase dialogue and joint projects. Now, since our center was formally established, our membership has drawn upon the many different departments of our university. And as such, we've acquired a more interdisciplinary focus. Currently, our center has 5 standing board members and 5 advisory members from departments as different as international relations, media, architecture, psychology, sociology, and international trade and finance. This conference that begins today is a product of the collective work of this group and carries this diversity in its many panels. So let me give you a little bit of background on the content of this conference, on the academic content of the conference that will be addressed over the next 3 days. We have certain conference themes that you will see time and time again. What I've done is try to cluster them into different headings, into certain different rough headings. Domestic and intimate partner violence definitely is one topic that keeps coming up over and over again, and our keynote speaker will actually give us his insight and his work into domestic and intimate partner violence. We have papers on various issues such as awareness, dowry, domination, health risks, child brides, and regional case studies. We have panels on literary representation and cinema, from classics to more regional works, from cult films to Bollywood. We have panels on the media that address TV series, newspapers, women's magazines, media discussions, cartoons, movies. We have different narratives of women's empowerment and survival. We have gendered perspectives in urban space. We have a panel on migration, foreign brides, and forced marriages. We have a panel on homophobia. We have another panel on sex trafficking and rape. We have another panel on law and human rights. And we also have a panel that assesses Turkey on the last day of the conference. What I would like to do now is actually give you a short little presentation. I'm going to take the privilege of actually hosting the event to give you a pirate presentation of gender and violence. So what I would like to do, let's see. Okay. Now, I begin by saying that gender violence is not just a women's issue. The United States defines violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life, I believe that it is also necessary to expand this definition to include sexual orientation and give it a more gendered perspective. So let me address some of the violence topics that we may overlook. Sexual abuse, rape, harassment, domestic violence, trafficking of women and girls, harmful cultural practices such as female genital mutilation, or forced feeding to find husbands. And this may sound funny to some, to feed women so that they find husbands so that they gain weight. It requires basically feeding women over 16,000 calories a day so that they actually gain weight and become more attractive to men. And it results in very long-term health consequences as well. Forced abortions, rape as a weapon of war, honor killings, maternal mortality, hate crimes, and the effects of these on men. Now, all of these issues are issues that we confront when we analyze different types of gendered violence. When we think of hard politics, we rarely think of the gendered perspectives, but they are real and they are fundamental. Addressing the topics that I have just listed, first of all, requires a strong and committed state. The many state agencies that must address these problems, ranging from the police forces to the legal system to health professionals who deal with the injuries, must be coordinated and educated to deal with violence. Not only must they be educated in dealing with violence once it has occurred, but they must also be educated in assessing and identifying violence before it occurs. A state exists to treat all of its citizens equally, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. How effective a state is in actually carrying out these duties is a matter of hard politics. So let me give you some statistics, because we always love statistics. We love to find out what happens statistically. So let me address what has happened in the world statistically when it comes to gender violence. 5,000 women and girls are killed each year worldwide in the name of honor by members of their own families, according to a UN Population Fund report in 2000. Women are regarded as vessels of family reputation and not as individuals. At least 60 million girls who would otherwise be expected to be alive are actually missing from various populations, mostly in Asia, as a result of sex-selective abortions, infanticide, or neglect. This is another UN study. What this means actually is, and we find this in the work of Nobel economist Amartya Sen, if you've read some of his work, he basically says, A, either that sometimes fetuses that happen to be female are aborted, or B, the girl child receives less distribution in the form of calories, health care, and many education in the household, which means that she doesn't have the equal chance at life that the male child has. And so she passes away, unlike the male child that requires much more attention. Now, globally, at least 1 in 3 women and girls is beaten or sexually assaulted in her lifetime. 4 million women and girls are trafficked annually, trafficked for sexual purposes. An estimated 1 million children, mostly girls, enter the sex trade each year. The most common act of violence against women is actually being slapped, an experience that was reported by 9% of women in Japan and 52% in provincial Peru. Rates of sexual abuse also vary greatly around the world, with partner rape being reported by 6% of women from Serbia and Montenegro, 46% of women from provincial Bangladesh, and 59% of women in Ethiopia. This is according to a World Health Organization survey of 2005. The Human Rights Commission of Pakistan reported that in 2002, there was a 25% increase in honor killings of women, with 461 women murdered by family members in 2002, in just 2 provinces alone. Approximately 100 to 140 million girls and women in the world have experienced female genital mutilation, with more than 3 million girls in Africa annually at risk for this practice. Now, in Eastern and Southern Africa, 17 to 22% of girls aged 15 to 19 are HIV positive, compared to 3 to 7% of boys of similar age. This pattern, seen in many other regions of the world, is evidence that girls are being infected with HIV by a much older cohort of men. A study in Nigeria found that 16% of hospital patients treated for sexually transmitted infections were younger than 5. Between 40 to 50% of women in the European Union experience unwanted sexual advances, physical contact, or other forms of sexual harassment at work. When it comes to war crimes, as our rector just spoke about, conservative estimates suggest that between 20,000 to 50,000 women were raped during the 1992 to 1995 war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. while 250,000 to 500,000 women and girls were targeted in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Between 50,000 and 64,000 women in camps for internally displaced people in Sierra Leone were sexually assaulted by combatants between 1991 and 2001. In the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, at least 200,000 cases of sexual violence, mostly involving women and girls, have been documented since 1996. But the actual numbers are believed to be much, much higher. Now, statistics are pretty hard to come by when it comes to acts of violence, mainly because some of these violences are not necessarily reported. Recent academic research also shows that when given numbers, audiences tend to be insensitive to the event being analyzed. To quote a very famous dictator, you kill one person, it's a homicide. You kill 1 million, it's a statistic, right? And that's exactly what happens with these violent acts. So I thought it would be a better idea for me to sensitize you by giving you some real-life cases that will draw your attention and hopefully your reaction. Let's begin with acid attacks. Acid attacks are important because this year's Oscar for the best documentary went to a movie about reconstructive surgery after acid attacks in Pakistan. Usually, these acts of violence are prevalent in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, and they're used to deliberately burn women who are viewed as unsubmissive or who are now unwanted by their husbands. In Pakistan, where many acid attacks occur yearly, only 2% of cases are successfully prosecuted. Since there are no real statistics and counting these victims is difficult as some are in conflict-ridden areas, it is difficult to say how many women are actually victimized. One study by a Pakistani NGO called the Progressive Women's Association in 2010 was able to identify 8,000 attacks in 2 cities in Pakistan and their 200-mile radius alone from when they started counting in 1994. This would mean an average of 500 per year that they have been able to identify. The real numbers are much higher. So here is my case study. Right? This is a profile of acid throwing. This beautiful woman that you see, her name is Fakra Yunus. Do you see this? Do you see this on, can we project this at all? Bilgisayarı yansıtabiliyor muyuz? There we go, okay. So this beautiful young woman that you see, her name is Fakra Yunus. She was married at the age of 19 to a very, very famous man by the name of Bilal Har, who happens to be a former MP from the research that I've seen, and a member of one of the most influential members, family members in Pakistan. At the age of 22, she decided to leave her husband due to domestic abuse, to continued domestic abuse. This is what happened to Fakra Yunus after an acid attack. At the age of 22, she was mutilated by her husband with an acid attack. He claimed that she had been a prostitute before they wed. He was acquitted of the crime 2 years after the attack. She escaped to Italy to receive medical attention. 12 years after the attack, just 2 weeks ago, she committed suicide by jumping off, I think it was the 6th floor of a building, because she could no longer take looking this way. What happened to her is a story of corruption. It's a story of money and power relations. It's a story of a state that doesn't necessarily care as much for its women as it does for its men, right? Now, let's talk about sex trafficking. This is an area in which I'll actually be doing an academic presentation sometime tomorrow or Friday. We'll have to check the schedule. When we think of sex trafficking, what we tend to think about are women in a lustful industry. But the reality is that sex trafficking is not an issue of sex, and it's not an issue of prostitution. It is a case of economic downfall, of the commodification of women in the face of modern-day slavery. An estimated 1 million women and girls enter the sex trade each year, many under false pretenses. Many women are lured by predators with promises of better jobs, a better life and future, and soon find themselves enslaved and working as prostitutes. They're given no material benefits, and their health is never a concern because they are highly expendable. So let me move on to my case study. This is the case study of Corina. This was something that affected me very much. There is an award-winning documentary by the name of Price of Sex. You can actually go onto their website and check out different stories. Corina looks like she's in her mid-40s, but in reality, Corina is only 29 or 30 years old. She was trafficked at the age of 14 from Moldova. Moldova is a former Soviet state. It is a state where the economic collapse led to the unemployment of many women who could not care for themselves. She was sold into prostitution in 5 countries: Germany, Montenegro, Italy, Bulgaria, and Kosovo. She spent 7 years in Kosovo. What it means to spend all of this time in Kosovo is this. There was an intervention, a NATO intervention in Kosovo. She serviced UN and NATO soldiers. So the soldiers that were sent there to do peacekeeping, to actually intervene for humanitarian reasons, ended up creating a humanitarian crisis of their own. She was forced to have sex with probably about 30 men a day. This is for years. And when she was repatriated, sent back to Moldova, she could not walk and she had to be sent in a wheelchair. This is the story of what happens to sex slaves. Now, let's talk about basically domestic and intimate partner violence. 1 in 3 women is abused by her intimate partner. Many do not share this with anyone, and some even feel that at times their mates are justified in abusing them. Many studies show that children that grow up in households where there is domestic violence are also more prone to violence, which continues this deadly cycle. I chose a special story of domestic violence here because it also calls into question media ethics. This is the profile of Şefika Etik from our very own Turkey. She was killed by her husband at the age of 33. Now, her husband was unemployed and kept accusing her of being basically disloyal and cheating on him. She left him many times, headed to the shelter, but there wasn't enough room, or he just kept coming back. She had 2 children. She had no job of her own, so she had to keep going back to the household. Now, once she came back, the last time she actually went back to her house, she was taking a shower. This was an hour after she came back. Her husband stabbed her in the back. Well, he stabbed her many times. And then the paramedics came, and a picture of her half-naked body with the knife still in the back was splashed all over the Turkish newspaper Habertürk, which called into question media ethics and how much of the violence we actually want to portray on the media, right? Now let's talk about honor killings. And this is also another issue that happens to be very important in Turkey. 5,000 women and girls, as I stated before, are killed each year in the name of honor. Having no individual liberty, these women are seen as vessels of family reputation and are liabilities once any shame has been brought to their families because of their independent actions. The families reclaim their honor by murdering these women and hence eliminating the source of shame. The act of murder, decided upon usually by family elders, is carried out by a younger male in the name of the family to avoid long prison sentences, or the woman is left to commit suicide to redeem herself. The effects of carrying out such a murder on young men are also just now beginning to be analyzed. I'm going to give you the case study of probably one of the most famous honor killings in Turkey, a woman by the name of Güldünya Tören. She was raped by a relative, and she was left pregnant. She escaped to Istanbul to escape this honor killing that was awaiting her. Her brothers found her in Istanbul, however. They shot her down in the middle of a street, but they failed to kill her. And then media reports came out that she had survived. People said that she had survived, so her brothers found out. And then her brothers visited the hospital where she was left unprotected. Obviously, somebody was trying to kill this woman, but nobody protected her in the hospital. Her brothers revisited her. This time they did the job correctly. She was killed in the hospital. Okay. Now, rape is a war crime. I am a political scientist, so I tend to look at things from a more political science perspective. When we talk of war, we talk of men's business, right? We look at the many articles or books. We focus on weapons, casualties, war strategies, and all of these other items that seem to be important in war. Yet the impact of war on women is quite significant. Women are seen as the spoils of war in combat, and the rape of women as war trophies goes back to ancient times. Yet rape as a war crime is still practiced in our modern world. From Bosnia to Sierra Leone to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this is a human rights violation that is still lacking a lot of scholarly attention. Now, I did research on Bosnian women. About 3%, according to my calculations, of Bosnian women according to the census of 1991, were actually raped as a war crime in Bosnia. So this is a profile of a victim. She didn't give her name. She wouldn't provide her name, from the town of Tuzla, which is the 3rd largest city in Bosnia-Herzegovina. She was kidnapped by Serbian irregular forces at a bus station. She was taken to a holding station where there were 170 other women, and of course some men, and they were being tortured, but the women were being tortured sexually. She was first tortured with razors and cigarette burns, and then she was raped by 16 men. And then one of the men said, well, she's just a peasant. We don't want to rape her anymore because she's not even worthy of our rape. So they exchanged her in a prisoner exchange. Then she found out she was pregnant. So this crisis then continued, and she had to undergo an abortion, and she could not tell her family because there's a stigma associated with having had premarital sex in the region. And my last two case studies, maternal mortality. Women's health are usually not a priority, and in many places around the world, women die in childbirth due to lack of medical supplies and staff. Many women are forced to endure pregnancy and childbirth with no medical attention. Even if a woman survives childbirth, she may have to live her life with disabilities if she is not given the proper care. The role of the state in providing a minimum level of health care to ensure the right to life of women should be expected, but is seldomly found in developing nations where developmental priorities are given to other projects. So here's a study of a woman in Cameroon. This is Prudence Lemakwono. Prudence, and this is from Nicholas Kristof's column in the New York Times. Prudence was a 24-year-old mother of 3 in Cameroon. She was pregnant with her 4th child. She received absolutely no prenatal assistance or attention, and when she went into labor, she was assisted by a traditional birth agent. Well, it turned out after 2 or 3 days of going through labor that she wasn't going to be able to deliver the baby because her cervix was closed. So this traditional birth agent decided that if she jumped up and down on her stomach, that the baby would be born. Instead, it actually ruptured her uterus. She was taken to a doctor who refused to operate on her without payment. And just to give you an idea of what that payment is, it was $100. Her family could only come up with 20, so the doctor didn't operate on her. She lost the baby died the first day that she was there. And 3 days later of lying there screaming and nobody taking care of her, she passed away. So here is what happens when we don't take care of maternal needs. And my last case study has to do with hate crimes. Now, hate crimes generally target someone because of their sexual orientation, race, color, ethnicity, or other differentiating conditions. These attacks tend to be especially brutal, and the exact numbers are pretty hard to come by because hate crimes are associated with sexual orientation, and this kind of research doesn't necessarily have many statistics available. Here is a profile of a hate crime, a man by the name of Ahmet Yıldız, one of the most famous hate crimes in Turkey. He was a college student at Marmara University. He was killed in 2008 while dining at a cafe by members of his family for being openly gay. His father is currently the top suspect, but is at large and has not been caught. Can we turn the lights back on? Işıkları tekrar açabilir miyiz? All right. Now, in all of these cases, the state or the system failed to protect these women and men. This is a matter of individual liberties and the right to life and the most basic right each human being has. So, I've given you all of these case studies, and it may look like they're far away, but I want to give you a little anecdotal story here. And the story goes like this. I was preparing this speech on Sunday night, and there was a commotion in the street where my house is located. A man was heard screaming on his cell phone, talking to basically a woman, and myself, along with all of my neighbors, rushed to the balcony to find out what was going on. I was late in catching parts of the conversation, but what I did hear afterward was basically enough to grasp what was happening. This man, who was in his either late 20s or early 30s, was screaming at his wife or else otherwise intimate partner who had obviously left him. His exact words were this: "If you continue this way, I will cut you. Your mother, your father, do you understand me? I will cut you into pieces." We all heard this. Now, he continued to shout and give his partner ultimatums, and the most important of which was that she should return that very evening from the refuge she had sought in her parents' home. Now, a gentleman who runs one of the nearby shops went after this man, tried to calm him down after he hung up the phone, and of course all of us returned to our homes, distraught but otherwise uninvolved. Now, if we look carefully, violence or the potential for violence is all around us. The man screaming on his phone to his wife did not commit an offense. If he were to kill his wife tomorrow, or if he were to hit her, most likely it would be seen as his first offense, and he will never be punished for the fear that he put in his partner through his controlling methods. We rarely think of threats screams, or otherwise psychological threats as violence, but in essence, they are exactly that. They are a pattern that manifests itself every day for many of the women around us, yet because it is so ordinary and so common, we have become desensitized and only think of violence when it physically harms someone else. Now, the work of Professor Evan Stark will challenge us to rethink all of this. It is impossible to read his work, Coercive Control, and not be moved by his insight into how coercive control is all around us. His seminal book, Coercive Control, which was published by the Oxford University Press, was named the best social science book published in 2007 by the American Publishers Association. In this critically acclaimed book, Dr. Stark fundamentally changes the way researchers, activists, and policymakers think about intimate partner abuse. He argues that domestic violence is neither domestic nor violence, and instead is a criminal violation of a woman's fundamental right to self-determination. Whatever your background, it is certain to move you. Now, Evan Stark is a forensic social worker and an award-winning researcher with an international reputation for his innovative work on the legal, policy, and health dimensions of interpersonal violence. Dr. Stark has served as an expert in more than 100 criminal and civil cases. He's a founder of one of the first shelters for abused women in the United States. And in the 1980s, Dr. Stark co-directed the Yale Trauma Studies Center with Dr. Anne Flitcraft, a path-breaking research that was the first to document the significance of domestic violence for women's health. He has consulted with numerous federal and state agencies and won a number of prestigious awards for his research and advocacy. Dr. Stark is a professor and director of public health at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers-Newark, and holds joint appointments in women and gender studies, and as a chair of the Department of Urban and Health Administration at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey's School of Public Health. We also thank the United States Department of State and its embassy in Ankara for sponsoring Professor Stark's keynote speech. So now I'd like to invite Professor Evan Stark to give his keynote lecture.
Teşekkürler. I apologize because I don't have my slides translated, and my Turkish is limited to what is written down for me on paper, phonetically in English. So please excuse me for that. And I want to thank Itır Bağdadi and the rector and all of you. I will say that I am in a department of women and gender studies that's supposed to be the largest in the world. And this is for the students who are here. I did want to say that not being in women and gender studies doesn't necessarily mean that, like Professor Bağdadi, or hopefully myself and some of the presenters, that you are an activist on behalf of women. Only a handful of our students are scholars as well as activists on behalf of women. And so I would just encourage the students who are here, whether you're soon-to-be Dr. Bağdadi's students or students of others, to look at the presenters in the next couple of days, not just for the substance of what they say, but as models that represent the fact that you can change the world at the same time that you study it, and that, in fact, change and study together are among the most satisfying and rewarding activities that you can engage in as a person. I'm going to start by talking about one of my cases. This is the case of a woman whose name is Dila Berisha. That's not a picture of Dila, that's a picture by Picasso, but in your imagination, in my imagination, This is Dila. Dila is an Albanian woman who had an arranged marriage to a Yugoslavian man. She lived in a fairly wealthy community in my home state of Connecticut in the US. She worked in a bank. There was a time during this relationship, I won't tell you too much about the case, and maybe during the rest of my presentation I'll talk more about it. But there came a time when she took a pistol, a gun, that her husband, Nick, had kept under his pillow and shot her husband 5 times in the head at point-blank range, killed him, and then went downstairs and called the police, and then went upstairs to get the gun because she believed that he might come after her. On the way to the police station, the police came and arrested her. On the way to the police station, she told a very strange story. Itır has talked to you about women whose stories involved horrendous violence, physical and sexual. But this is the story that Dila told the police. Her name was, married name was Bayless. Mrs. Bayless described her husband as a very complex person. She stated that he had always demanded from her an exact outline of how she spent her day. She said that she would have to prepare a summary of meals planned for the month for his approval. She said, and this is in quotes, this is all from the police report, he was never happy with macaroni or steak and potatoes. By the way, Itır picked a wonderful restaurant last night for us to eat, so I thank her for that. He was never happy with macaroni or steak or potatoes, but instead demanded meals such as veal marsala, or even when such menus planned, with such menus planned, she said she could never please him. She never did anything good enough for his demands. She relayed one incident which prompted a beating, explaining that they had bought their house about 1 year ago. He once asked her to tell him what they needed for the house. She said she began to name some things, nothing specific named, the police officer writes down. And he asked her if she thought shades were important for the windows. She replied, yes, they were also something that they needed. He then demanded to know why she hadn't thought of that herself, why she wasn't caring enough. And he then began to beat her. What we're going to talk about for the next hour or so, and Itır suggests a little bit of this, is a movement that is now almost as widespread in the world as the movement we started almost 40 years ago to make domestic violence a crime. And this really involves what I'm going to call and talk to you about coercive control. The first thing I want to say is that nothing in my book or that I'm going to talk about this morning is critical of what we have accomplished in this incredible revolution that we have made over the last 40 years. When we began the domestic violence revolution, when we started, as some of you may know, by having women in our own houses who were running from abusive men. And then when our houses became crowded, we took buildings in the community. In England, we seized them, and we turned them into the first battered women's shelters. In Sweden, in Mexico, in Canada, and all throughout the United States, we started these shelters. When we started, domestic violence was not only not a crime, but it was common practice for police to come to domestic violence calls and simply walk the man around the block and allow him to return to the house, where, of course, his beatings resumed. Women had no protections in the courts, and women routinely lost custody of their children if they claimed abuse during divorce cases. And there are many, many other things that I could talk about. But since that time, last year, for example, in the United States, we sheltered and served 5 million women and children, compared to 0 40 years ago. We arrested more than 1 million men for domestic violence crimes, and we gave hundreds of thousands of protection orders to women, prosecuted, and we also provided counseling in over 2,000 programs for abusive men. As you know from your own experience in Turkey, the first signatory of the International Convention on Domestic Violence, the revolution is worldwide. There's not a major city anywhere in the world almost that you can go to which doesn't host today a shelter or a refuge or a program for battered women. And yet, I want you to also understand that the domestic violence revolution that we started 40 years ago is stalled. For example, in the United States, although we arrested 1 million men last year for domestic violence crimes, almost none of these men actually go to jail. In fact, we estimate that perhaps 1 incident of violence in 10,000 results in any kind of sanction whatsoever. Hardly the kind of forceful state response that we can expect to inhibit domestic violence by others. Although domestic violence is now widely recognized by our child welfare system in the United States, and I could present similar evidence for the UK or Scotland and many other countries, it is routine practice when domestic violence arises in a child welfare case to take the children away from women, charge the mothers for being exposed to domestic violence by offering, for example, their necks to be choked, and to remove those children and charge the mothers with neglect. In medicine, Itır mentioned our research that showed that domestic violence was the leading cause of injury for which women sought medical attention. Today, medical identification of women victims of domestic violence is no different than it was in 1974 when we first did our research. And although we sheltered, as I indicated, almost 5 million women and children in the United States last year, many of our shelters have become replicas of the very social services that we set out to change. The woman comes out of a house where she has been controlled into a battered woman's shelter where there are rules for how she must behave and how she must comply with things. Instead of being spaces from which women could join collectively in acts of liberation, acts of community transformation, they have become individual service points in many communities. Not all, of course, but in many communities, and certainly not in your shelter organization in France, and perhaps not in Scotland, but this is a real problem. In fact, we've turned domestic violence into what we call a second-class misdemeanor, somewhere between driving too quickly. And in fact, in my own, where I teach in the state of New Jersey, when you're arrested for a domestic violence crime, you go to traffic court, where the judge looks down at you standing next to the woman you abused and says, "Will you do it again?" "No, Your Honor, I will not do it again." And before the couple is out to the parking lot, he has her hand behind her back, making clear who's boss, as has the court, in some sense, reinforced his power. I'm going to have to do a technology thing here. So, next. Okay, let me try that. I just put one table in here to illustrate something. And this is evidence from the United States. But it's not that different in other countries. In Canada, for example, we have similar data. What this table shows you is that since domestic violence began, domestic violence killings have dropped dramatically in the United States. But if you look at this table, what you'll see is that they've dropped dramatically for men. In a matter of fact, among African American men in the United States, when the domestic violence revolution began, it was just as likely that an African American woman would kill an intimate abusive partner as it was that he would kill her. Killing of African American men has dropped 80%, but the killing of African American women has dropped less than 1% a year. And the killing of Caucasian women, the majority of women in the United States, has not dropped 1 percentage point in 40 years. Now, there's nothing wrong with keeping men alive, even abusive men. But it is a strange and paradoxical outcome of a movement set out to protect women. Now, how do I explain this? We explain this by the fact that men tend to kill women when they believe the women are going to separate or leave them, or they actually do so. In fact, the majority of the women who are killed in domestic violence fatalities are killed after they leave or are intending to leave abusive men. And separated and single women and divorced women are actually at a higher risk than married women. The only group of women who's at a low risk are widows, which I have to say is not lost on many of my clients, like Dila Barisha. In other words, as long as he's in the picture, there is a risk, there is a danger. But by providing shelter, well, and I should say that women tend to kill men, not always in self-defense, but when they feel they have no other option, when they feel they can't escape. So by giving women shelter, by arresting men, by providing women with protection orders, we have given them alternatives to taking the lives of the men who are abusing them. Now, I know this is much less of a problem in Turkey, but as you know, everyone in America, women and men, have guns. And in Canada, and we now have a case you've probably been following in Florida, where you don't even have to retreat in a situation. You can just shoot the guy. And we have states in the United States now where students routinely bring their weapons to school, in college, and university campuses. So guns are very widespread. In domestic violence, you may know this, that if the crime occurs in the bedroom, the woman gets the worst of it. But if it occurs in the kitchen, men watch out, because that's where knives and other things are stored. But what I want you to understand is that by providing protections for women, we have protected men. But, and this is the crucial point, because the protections we provide are temporary, and some would say completely ineffective, and in many communities in the United States, as is true here in Turkey as well, completely invisible, women are just as at risk after they've called the police, if not more so, than before they have done it. Now, of course, the answer that we're going to try to come together on today is not that we should eliminate laws against domestic violence or eliminate shelters or eliminate these options, but to bring those options in line with the actual experiences of the women like Dila Berisha who are living in these relationships, to close the gap between what women and children are actually experiencing in these homes and what the law and the medical care system and even academics define as domestic violence as a crime. What we've done is taken the gender out of domestic violence, even though we recognize that it is directed at women. We've done this by defining domestic violence, at least in the United States, in the law, and this is the way it is also defined and treated here in Turkey and in the UK and in France and elsewhere, as an incident of violence. Each incident of violence, and you saw some of the dramatic incidents that Itır put on the screen, each incident of violence is a domestic violence crime. And we rank these incidents, as you saw from the horrendous pictures that resulted from the acid burns, by what I call a calculus of harms. The more injury, the more serious the crime. The more psychological trauma, the more serious the crime. And even though we don't require that a woman be injured before we arrest, and in my community, if someone were threatening on the cell phone where I live in Connecticut in the way that you described it, he would be arrested and thrown in jail within minutes. But he would be out just as quickly, and probably even angrier and more able to recommit domestic violence. And the other myth that we have, or another part of our degendered understanding, is that domestic violence is about intimate relationships. And we'll see what that means. But part of what I want to say, it's about the family. It's a family crime, don't you know? And of course, what I've already suggested in talking about separation and talking about divorced and single women as at higher risk is that it is not really about intimate relations. Or if the relationship is intimate, like the man on the cell phone, it's intimate only in his own mind. It's his right to his property that defines the intimate context in which this is occurring. I guarantee you that the woman at the other end of that cell phone call is not falling over herself because the intimacy of the relationship is somehow being jeopardized by his threats. So what we need to understand is that this model, this degendered model of domestic violence, which is reflected in almost all the laws in all of our countries, which is reflected in almost all of the court decisions and all of the medical interventions, and in many other social work contexts, does not fit women's experience. Let's look at women's experience across the lifespan. And all I've done with this table is to try to show you that for women, the risk of physical violence is continuous. 35% or so of all the injuries we see to girls 16 to 18 are the result of intimate partners. And 18% of all of the injuries we see to women in their 60s are the result of intimate partners. I'm not talking here about elder abuse, where you have a frail elderly victim, but about long-standing partner violence. So this is across women's lifespan, and of course we could take it back to child abuse and what have you. This is just, I made this table just to compare some of the statistics for women in the US and Turkey. The figures for Turkey are somewhere between 30 to 50%. By the way, the research that has been done by academics in Turkey is among the finest and most academically credible in the world in terms of documenting domestic violence, and compares favorably to anything we've done in the United States, including our National Violence Against Women survey, which is the largest and most credible piece of work. It shows that somewhere between 30 and 50% of women in Turkey are at risk of being assaulted during their lifetime, and this includes childhood assaults, that at any particular time, and that, by the way, you'll see in a few minutes, is comparable to the figures we have for England and the United States. It's not dramatically higher. Current domestic violence is reported by about 1 in 12 women in Turkey, but only a tiny percentage of these women, and this is a major difference, disclose a report, only 5 or 10%. So that means that 90 to 95% of women do not disclose a report in Turkey, domestic violence. Now, why is this important? It's important because, as you'll see in a minute, domestic violence is typically repeated dozens of times. When Dila Berisha came to trial, I was able to document more than 300 assaults that she had experienced. Her fingers had been so swollen, you know the rings you get in the wedding? Her fingers were so swollen that it would be impossible, they had to be surgically removed from her hands. They were swollen because when he would kick her in the head, in his nightly ritual, she would try to protect her head, and he would kick her hands. But although she suffered 300 at least separate assaults, and imagine how ridiculous it is to treat each of those assaults as a separate crime. We have evidence now, huge study in England, that shows that men who commit 50 domestic violence assaults and are arrested 10 or 20 times receive no more punishment than men who commit 1 assault. And I'm going to go over this point again and again, but the reason for this is obviously because each assault is treated as a separate event, as a separate crime, instead of the chronic problem that it tends to be. But, and my own research, as Itır suggested, showed that domestic violence was the leading cause of injury for which women seek medical attention. It's more common than auto accidents and muggings and rapes, all of them combined. But now I'm going to try to tell you that the evidence Itır presented on slaps is actually more relevant to what we're doing here than the physical disfigurement that we see in the domestic violence posters or in the dramatic slides that were shown. What I've done in this table is taken evidence from 3 places where we think we would see the most dramatic injuries resulting from domestic violence: the hospital emergency room, people who call the police and are arrested in domestic violence situations, and from the military, where in the United States at least we have very severe and very high rates of domestic violence. And what you will see is that in these 3 sites, which are the most serious, 90 to 99% of all domestic violence involves non-injury, low-level violence that would not in any way attract the attention of a police officer who was used to stabbings or shootings, would not impress medical personnel, and yet 99% of all domestic violence is trivial from a medical or a criminal justice standpoint. Now, does that mean domestic violence is trivial? Of course not. But what makes it significant is not the severity of the violence involved, which typically is not injurious. What makes it serious is the fact that in these cases, typically, there have been dozens, hundreds, even thousands of assaults. Go back. I said one reason the domestic violence revolution is stalled is because domestic violence has been turned into a second-class misdemeanor. You don't have to be a genius in your statistics to understand that if 99% of all incidents involve pushing, slapping, grabbing, hair pulling, even punching, then if you treat each episode as a separate crime, that 99% of the crimes for which we arrest men in domestic violence cases will be trivial. Do you have some sense of what I'm saying there? That the fact is that domestic violence is not a discrete event. We find domestic violence is an isolated episode in fewer than 10% of cases. In 40 to 50% of the cases, we're encountering what we call serial abuse, where women are being abused 3 and 4 times weekly. The average abusive relationship in the United States, and in Turkey it lasts even longer, lasts between 5.5 and 7.2 years. So if you multiply serial abuse times the number of years, which in public health we do in order to determine what we call the prevalence of domestic violence, what you find is that hundreds, even thousands of assaults is more common than finding a situation in which there's been a single assault. So it is not the severity of the violence that marks the physical abuse. It is although, as we've seen and we've heard, it is a major cause of fatality. Rape is a major problem. When we studied all the rapes in the United States, in our hospitals, we found that over half of them were committed in the context of domestic violence, which often involve multiple rapes. Women are disfigured in the ways that you saw and you will see in the posters, but that the most dramatic impact of domestic violence is the cumulative effect of multiple assaults extended over a period of time. And I hope you're thinking ahead of me about what that implies for how we change the law and how we change our practice in terms of understanding this. I'll have more to say about this in a minute. I do want to stop, though, just here in a moment and talk about the sexual violence. Throughout our domestic violence revolution, we have not come to terms with the extent to which sexual violence, not just rape, but coerced sex of a whole range of forms, have become commonplace in domestic violence. 50% of the rape victims that we saw in our hospital study at Yale, where I was researching at the time, were committed by men who were also physically abusing their wives. 27 to 40% of women in the United States identify that they have been sexually assaulted during their lifetime. You see that the figure from Turkey is a little higher. But what's fascinating is that sexual assault is almost 5 times as commonly reported as a current problem by abused women in the United States as it is in Turkey. So this doesn't mean it's not important in Turkey, but it means that there are somehow counterintuitive differences between our societies that you might not expect. And what you can see here is that actual rape, where there's, by definition of the law, makes up 25% of the sexual violence that women in Turkey report. It's much less in the United States. It's 13%, but remember, I'm not trying to, it's 13% of 27%. And degrading sexuality, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that important. This is, I've shown you this already, so am I going ahead here? So what is women and children's reality? Just to finish this particular point. The first thing we have to understand about violence against women in relationships is that it's ongoing. It is much more akin to a chronic disease like HIV and heart disease. Of course, it's not a disease, but just to understand it in terms of a public health model, than it is to something like the flu. It has much more in common with hostage taking and kidnapping, as you'll see in a minute, which is a continual, ongoing course of conduct than it does with the physical assaults that we currently identify with domestic violence. Secondly, it almost always includes sexual violence. And that should give you some notion of what the seriousness of the crime is. Now, this may not seem as obvious to you, but the important thing to understand about how women and children experience abuse is that it is cumulative. That means that what you see on Friday when a woman calls the police, the level of fear she presents, her reluctance to complain, is the consequence of all that has come before throughout the relationship, not the consequence of what's happening that night. So, for example, if police or a lawyer come to the house and they see a woman whose fear level is up here, but the actual incident only involved a slap or a push, and you look only at the incident, you're going to conclude she's a nutcase, that she's crazy because she's exaggerating, and you won't take her seriously. It's only when you put the level of fear she's experienced, her hesitancy, her ambivalence about simply leaving the guy or doing whatever, into the context of everything that has come before, that this makes sense to you. And this affects us in shelters as well as any place else. What we're also going to learn now is that domestic violence is not particularly about violence, even frequent low-level violence. From the first women we hid in our home, and I remember as if it were yesterday, a woman and child coming and staying with my wife and myself who had been hiding in a car for 9 days, eating only some awful cold cereal, high-carb diet. Well, I can't criticize high-carb diets in Turkey, but anyway, she had been eating very bad cereal, a very bad diet, living in this car. And the abuse she'd experienced was pretty bad. And yet, she told us violence wasn't the worst part. And women had been saying that to us since the first time we started dealing with rape and rape crisis. Violence isn't the worst part. And our response when they said that, because we knew how difficult it was to talk about the violence, was to point them at the violence again and say, talk about the violence. Tell us how, because we knew how difficult it was, about what he did to you physically. We had been groomed on TV shows and posters with the black eyes and the wounded faces, and we wanted to hear those stories. And when they came to shelter, those were the dramatic cases that we felt we had to intervene in first. It took us 25 years to understand where we are now, what it meant, what they meant when they were saying violence wasn't the worst part. The other thing that we've learned is, and this is critical for us both as academics and as advocates and people who are activists, that domestic violence crosses social space. There's nothing that pleases me more than the discussion of space in a conference on gender violence, because everything in women's lives is about the space that men occupy versus the space that women occupy. And I know this because I have thousands of books in my house, and for years my family has struggled to try to shrink the space that I occupy through my books, my learning, which is absolutely critical to my survival, of course. But domination occupies a space and shrinks the space of others in ways that we have only begun to understand. And if people cannot occupy space, as we tried to demonstrate by seizing parks in the United States about 6 months ago, if people cannot occupy space, they cannot imagine themselves as fully developed persons, because to do that requires that they occupy space. But the fact that domestic violence crosses social space, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is significant because what it teaches us is that separation is no antidote. The fact that we have a court which allows a woman to live separately and prohibits, say, her husband or her boyfriend from coming to her house or contacting her in no way protects her, given the electronic means we have of communicating via cell phone or surveillance or what have you. So we've talked about that. When abuse is viewed through a degendered context, all of the things that I've talked about to you happen. Domestic violence is turned into a second-class misdemeanor. In fact, what happens when we view domestic violence as an incident rather than a course of conduct is that over time, our response actually becomes less aggressive. In other words, the more domestic violence accumulates, the more the police come to the home, the more the courts have to deal with the woman. Even in shelters, when women return, again and again and again, there is not a service provider I know who won't, at some level of their being, begin to blame the victim, to begin to believe that there must be something about this particular type of woman that causes her to come back again and again. Now just stop for a minute and think. Most of you are too young to know this, but if you have a chronic disease, God forbid, but if you keep eating with the diet that you have in Turkey, there's going to be a lot of it if there isn't already. But if you have a chronic disease, your doctor wants you to come back. And if you don't come back, your doctor reaches out to find you. How different is that expectation and the understanding that using the same service again and again and again is not a sign of an ambivalent or psychologically scarred woman, but the sign of an aggressive help seeker who is doing all she can on her own to try to make things better and free herself. You see what I'm saying? So changing that context is absolutely critical. What we've done with the domestic violence definition is normalize domestic violence. When my police officers, whom I train, and we're going to have some opportunity to talk to police here in Turkey and prosecutors over the next few days, when my police officers come to a home that they've been to many times before, they know exactly what to expect. They know that they're going to find the woman bleeding, the husband drunk. In fact, calling the police becomes part of the ritual of the abuse. The very service system that we hope would protect, and it's not so much because the police are prejudiced. Of course, the police in Turkey, as in the United States and elsewhere, need training. But understand that even if the police are perfectly trained to come into a domestic violence situation, so long as their only window is the particular incident in front of them, they don't have the tools to recognize the type of oppression that is taking place. We now think that what we're looking at when we look at domestic violence are two very different phenomena. And by the way, Deela, just to give you an example, I said she'd been assaulted 300 times. Deela had one medical visit. There was one time when Nicola had slammed the car door and broken her finger. So she went to the doctor and told the doctor that she had caught her finger in the car door. But that was the only medical visit. Imagine if you wait for violence to cause injury before you intervene. You would miss 99% of all domestic violence. 99%. And remember, the significance doesn't lie in the injury, but in the chronicity, the ongoing nature of what's happening. And now we'll see it lies somewhere else as well. So I define coercive control as an oppressive course of conduct designed to retain privilege and establish domination over women in personal life. You can question me if we have time about that, but that just gives you a thumbnail. And I want you to get the idea that men, I'm not saying these are crazy, sick men. When I describe my caseload to friends or others, oh, these guys must be crazy. Well, domestic violence is a kind of pathology, but it's what I call a normal pathology. That is, it's a pathology that's not rooted in psychiatric illness, but rooted in the gender norms of an unequal society, and the race norms, and the hetero-sexist norms of an unequal society. When we're looking at coercive control, we're looking at least these 4 dimensions: assault, intimidation, that's the coercion part, and degradation and isolation and control. I couldn't figure out technically how to get degradation onto this slide, so you'll have to bear with me. The assault, and I should say, by the way, that somewhere, I don't know if I have a slide on this, let me see, no, I don't know. So I'll tell you now, and then if I have it, I'll skip it. In the United States, we estimate that 80% of all the women who seek our services are victims of coercive control. The other 20% are victims of what we call partner assault or domestic violence. That is, there's only been physical violence, there's only been emotional or psychological abuse, but there hasn't been this pattern of intimidation, isolation, degradation, and control. In Turkey, where there's been some excellent research on this, the figure's a little higher. It's about 84% of the victims who use services are victims, or who are abused, are victims of coercive control, not partner assault. I'm not saying they haven't been assaulted. I'm just saying that you can't understand what's happening to them or their reactions through this prism. When we're dealing with assault in coercive control, as I indicated, we're dealing essentially with violence as routine. And unless you've worked in this area, this is going to surprise some of you. For millions of men, hitting women, abusing women, is as routine as using the toilet or going or eating dinner. We have some evidence that the heart rate of abusive men actually goes down during abusive incidents. That is, they're relaxed. I have had case after case. If you wait for the pathologically angry man with the typical personality, the basic husband, who, when the team loses, goes on a tirade and you have to walk around, the TV and not maybe pretend it's broken so he doesn't have to see any more football that afternoon or what have you. But the typical abuser is actually not somebody who has problems controlling his anger. In fact, anger has almost nothing to do with it. Most domestic violence, most of you probably know this, most domestic violence doesn't occur in conflict situations. In fact, the whole point of domestic violence is to avoid conflict. Don't let her challenge you, and to suppress conflict. This is one of the paradoxical things we do with men, is we teach them how to fight. Abusive men, we teach them how to fight. Because most of these men have no idea that they could ever get what they want by asking for it. Well, they might have a little frustration, but it's still the same. But the thing about assault is that it tends to be routine rather than dramatic. And it tends to occur repeatedly over a long period of time, and of course, tends to have a sexual component. Intimidation tactics run the gamut, and I don't have time really to talk about the range of these things. From literal threats like the ones Itır overheard on the telephone to kill, threats with weapons, threats to kill your family, threats of honor killings, threats to your neighbors and your parents and what have you, literal threats to kill. Stalking is one of the most dramatic examples and is highly associated with fatality in domestic violence cases. Stalking in marriage. I have many clients whose husbands have them followed or follow them directly even while they're married. But intimidation tactics extend to tactics that are only visible as threats to the victim herself. I don't know how this case example will translate, but I'll try. One of my clients is a pitcher in softball, which is an underhanded form of baseball, which is also maybe not so familiar. But anyway, you just have to take my word for it. She's a great athlete. And her husband comes to all of the games that she pitches, which makes her teammates very, very envious because their husbands are off drinking, or celebrating or doing something else. But they have an agreement in their relationship that she will not make him jealous. She will not make him jealous. Now, you know who the judge is and jury in that particular rule. So when she begins to do very well in the game, she begins to, we call it strike out. She strikes out many, many batters in a row. He begins to feel that sense of emptiness, that people are paying attention, not to me, but to her. She should be paying attention to me. Everyone should be paying attention to me. That's why I love speaking. So he comes down onto the field where she's playing with her sweatshirt, her overshirt. And he approaches her and he says to her, "Darling, you're cold. Here is your sweatshirt." And the other players on the team, we wish our husband would even remember that I have feelings about hot and cold, let alone come down and bring me my sweatshirt. But she doesn't react that way. She breaks out in a cold sweat, and she is unable to continue playing. Why? Because only she understands that she will have to cover up that night, that the message he is sending her is that she will have to cover her arms that night because she has broken the rule about making him jealous. So much of the intimidation, I don't know if this translates like I say, but much of the intimidation we see is basically only understood by the victim herself. A certain look, a certain tightening of the muscles, a certain smile that she knows will result in punishment and victimization. So like I say, intimidation runs the gamut. In almost all of these cases, women are isolated, and you'll see some figures on Turkey in a minute, as well as the United States, from all the significant others in their lives from whom we get our identity, from our friends, from our family members, from our children, from our co-workers if we work, from all of the moorings from which we get not only social support, but also an understanding of reality that is different from the understanding of reality that he is giving us. And isolation can also be self-imposed, because if all of my friends, as he says, are idiots or prostitutes, then I may want to placate him by stopping my friendships. And we find that as women become isolated and women become intimidated, even when there is no violence, they then are vulnerable to abuse in ways that they have not been before. We have some evidence from a national survey in Finland, for example, that the women who report the highest levels of fear associated with abuse have not been physically assaulted for an average of 10 years or more. In one of my Ph.D. students' research, she discovered that 25% of the women that she interviewed in a multiracial population who had all the signs and symptoms of being victims of domestic violence had not been physically assaulted. Their subjugation, their fear, had been incited directly by a combination of intimidation, isolation, and control. And I'll come to control in a minute. But I did want to talk about degradation, because in my book, I don't do justice to this, and I have since become much more sensitized to this issue. I know that we're in an audience whose sensitivities to matters sexual is different than our so-called liberated audiences in the US. But I think it's important to understand that sexual degradation and humiliation is as profoundly dehumanizing and even more dehumanizing than much of the physical violence that the women we work with suffer. I've just put some examples. A very popular one in the United States is tattooing, marking, letting everyone in the community, if you don't live in a community in which it's known that families will protect their own, or your family and his family are not known, then having a mark of ownership, a tattoo or a burn, as in one of the cases Itır cited, frequently men are putting cigarettes out on their partner's arms and legs. This is not just because they're trying to hurt them. It's also because they want to communicate to the outside world that this is my partner. And women who are marked in this way are ashamed to go out because they believe, and many other men will interpret this sign this way, not by feeling sympathy for the woman who has been burned, but by recognizing her mark as a signal that she can be had. In other words, that a man can own her and do with her as he will. Sexual inspections are almost universal in one form or another in domestic violence cases. In the last week, in coercive control cases, in the last month really, I have had cases where men followed women through the grass, went through all of the cabinets, inspected their underwear, did all kinds. I'll give you an example, a case example. I'll try to make it brief, because these are not examples that are going to shake your mind into tears of recognition as injuries will do. But I want you to try to imagine, this is a religious woman, a deeply religious woman, a Muslim woman in my city of Newark, where we have a large Muslim community, whose father is actually an imam, and who marries a man, and she's a nurse, and her ritual is that she goes to work every day. She comes home from the hospital about 3 in the afternoon. She changes her clothes and takes a shower and then goes out to shop. He comes home, and his first act is to go to the hamper where the clothes are put, the dirty clothes, and to take out her undergarments and to inspect them. I don't know if you know men who have this secret ability, but in the United States, men have this secret ability to discover, by looking at clothes, by sniffing them, by touching them, they have this ability to know what your social life is like. Like Foucault, they read it like a hieroglyph of the underwear. I don't know if anybody is delivering a paper on this tomorrow, but it's very important. But anyway, in response to his inspections, of course, he always discovers that she's been unfaithful, and he beats her. Now, she develops a practice, which is that when she comes home, she takes off her clothes, she takes a shower, but then she puts back on the same clothes that she wore during the day. Now, that may seem completely trivial to you, but to this religious woman who has grown up in a family of decency and purity, that small act reflects a level of humiliation and degradation that is as profound in many ways as sexual assault might be to another person. She is now completely without self-esteem and self-respect, even though it seems like such a small act. One of the fascinating things about coercive control is how personal it is. You can learn how to be physically violent from any stupid TV show or American sitcom, for that matter, as well as the movies. But there is no book on how to do coercive control for dummies. Coercive control has to be learned, and many of the men who do it are not what you would call geniuses. So coercive control has to be learned, and part of the way it's learned is by the intimacy, the privileged access to personal knowledge about women that men gain from intimacy. And of course, in same-sex or transgendered relationships, degradation based on race or sex or gender identity is a very common thing. Having women crawl like animals, analogizing them to animals, and so forth. Now remember, what's different here is what we might call the or-else proviso. That is to say, if somebody were to say to me, I want to inspect you because, or to you probably, I want to inspect you because I want to know if you've been with another man, you would say, absolutely not. Get out of my life, get out of my house, it's over. Or at least you would laugh, and that would be the end of it. But understand that for women who are involved in coercive controlling relationships, that option does not exist because of the costs, physical and otherwise, that any kind of resistance incurs. So that in many ways, the smaller the offense that you have to acknowledge and comply with, the larger the feeling of humiliation because of your deep realization that you cannot respond. I'll give you another case example. This is a woman who is an anchor on one of our largest, well, she was, on one of our largest TV channels. And her husband does the morning news for NBC. It's one of the biggest TV channels in the United States. And they live in a huge mansion, much bigger than this. I don't know why I'm putting my arms like this, but you get the idea. Big. And he has a rule that she must answer the telephone when he calls by the third ring, because he doesn't want it to be with other men. He has 2 children by a previous marriage, worthless children that she must take care of. She has this huge estate to manage. Of course, she can't hire any help because that would make him even more jealous. So here's a rule that she must answer the phone by the third ring. Now, this is a woman who won an Emmy for a documentary, who is an anchor woman, who's one of the most powerful economically and politically situated women in the United States. And yet, when I was interviewing her in my office and the telephone rang, the rash began, the hives began at her fingertips and had covered her entire body and face before the phone rang a third time. That is the or-else phenomena. You understand what I'm saying? So these are not weak women, but women whose strength is diminished by these activities. This is Deela's first encounter right after they were married. You know, the ceremony where a young boy is put on her lap, so she will have boy children, and you know, she gets the rings and so forth. This was the rape that occurred. And if violence is routine, so is sexual violence routine. And I want you to read this, or I'll read it to you. He told me he wanted to fool around, and I told him no. He kept persisting and taking off my clothes, and I kept fighting him off. He took his belt and tied my hands behind my back. You didn't know what you were coming into. Well, there's talk about that. Anyway, and tied my hand behind my back. And he had fun. I never wanted him to do that again like that, and so I never said no. So are there subsequent sexual encounters also sexually coerced? They're not rapes, but her compliance based on the fear is certainly there. I want to sort of tie up what I'm saying. We only have about 10 minutes left. And I want you to know that the reason you're not having lunch is because the cafeteria is not ready for you, so you might as well stay. From the beginning of our movement, we have understood that domestic violence was about power and control. What we have not come to terms with, although laws are beginning to change, what we have not come to terms with is that control is also the means of domestic violence. And in many ways, as research is now showing us, control turns out to be more significant as a predictor of fatality, as a predictor of violence, than physical violence itself. And that is because the aim of control is to reduce a woman's capacity to resist and escape. What makes a battered woman, as the feminist historian Linda Gordon says, is her socially constructed inability to escape. Coercive control, as you'll learn now, is not about what men do to women. It is not about that. It is about what men prevent, with society's collaboration, women doing for themselves. Unless you understand women as full persons with the capacity to use their imagination to develop and thrive, you cannot understand domestic violence. Because it is not the fact that he hits her that is in his mind. What's in his mind is preventing her from being her own person, her own kind of adult, following her life goals in a way, whether they're familial or occupational or educational or what have you, in that way. So what do we think about control? Control involves at least these three processes: exploitation. He takes her money. 54% of the men we are now arresting in domestic violence cases acknowledge themselves that they have taken their partner's money. They've stolen it. And that is not a crime in the US. It is if you steal money, but not defined as theft when you take your partner's money. And they deprive them of basic material resources, food, ability to drive, clothing. Many of the women, I had a case recently of a woman from South Asia who was only allowed to wear a sari, but she lived in upstate New York, in which the weather is below 20 well, it used to be before global warming, now it's a tropics island, but the temperature averages below 20, so she simply couldn't go out of doors. So deprivation, material deprivation, social deprivation, exploitation. But the heart of coercive control, it turns out, is micro-regulation of how women go about their daily lives in general, and specifically how they enact those roles, those gender roles, which women inherit by default simply because they are women. That is, how they cook, how they clean, how they sleep, how they engage in sex, what they wear. Now, this may again seem relatively trivial to you, but if you recognize that in the old days, when we in the United States, like you in Turkey, lived in what was effectively a theocratic regime, how we dressed, how we cleaned, how we cared for our children, how we cooked, was regulated by the family, the community, and religion, by the church in the United States, and by the mosque and other agencies here. But as societies have become more secularized, and particularly in Western Europe and the US, but also in Turkey, those controls are no longer as effective or no longer in place at all. The result is that men, if they want to live in a patriarchy, have to invent it. They have to create it at the level of personal life. To make women obedient in a world in which women can star in TV shows and be presidents and run banks and large corporations means to reconstruct the patriarchy at the level of personal life, and that is the aim of coercive control. Just to give you some idea of the comparative statistics, isolation from friends and family is reported by 21% of women in Turkey, and you can read these figures for yourself. Interestingly, in Turkey, it's all financial decisions, which is 54%. In the United States, it's actually taking money from women because the rate of women's involvement in the labor market in the U.S. is so much higher than it is here. Here, I think it's around 27%. I could be wrong. In the U.S., it's around 80%. And in fact, women's labor market participation in England and the United States is now higher than men's. So this is really significant because it means that women have access to independent economic resources. This just gives you some very quick insight into these. These are data based on thousands of cases. I don't have how many men in Turkey took the money, but here, monitored their time, which means being accountable, and so forth. I'm going to skip over this, but you just have to take my word for it. But let me tell you what won the case for us. You remember I started by reading this crazy-sounding recitation of menus, of having to make veal marsala that dealer reported to the police as the reason she killed her husband. How crazy could that be? It turned out that the brunt of the coercive control in Dealer's life was what was called the logbook. And the logbook was a book that Dealer was expected to keep every day, in which she was to record every expense she made, every action she took, everything she did with Nicola, her son, or her, anything that she did, including all the menus, which she was to submit for his approval, and later also for the approval of his mother and his sister who were living with them and whom Dealer was also expected to serve. And he would come home from work. He was a hard-working man. He would come home from work, have a few beers, call Dealer downstairs, and then question her about the logbook. And inevitably, there was something that she had done which didn't really please him or serve the family in the way that he believed it should be served. For example, she had left the lights on to cost them electricity, or she had turned the lights off, which in turn didn't let his mother and sister enjoy the fruits of his affluence and demonstrate to them appropriately how he had succeeded in America, and he would beat her. When I explained the logbook to the court, the man who was prosecuting Dealer for murder thought he had me, and he said, "Dr. Stark, what would you say if I told you that I make my wife keep a record of every expense on our computer, and at the end of each month I go over these expenses with her item by item? Would you say I was an abuser, doctor?" Now, of course, the prosecutor was not an abuser, perhaps, but he just didn't get it. And 2 hours later, Dealer walked out of the courtroom a free woman, because the judge and every member of the jury understood that if that had happened to a man, if a man had been required to do that and degraded in the ways that we've described and forced to comply with the most trivial wishes and demands, from how to high the bedspread should be from the floor to what kind of clothes he wore, and he had killed his partner, he would never have been charged with murder, but everyone would have recognized his harm. When our vice president, the man who ran for president in the United States in the last election, our senator from Arizona, was kept as a prisoner of war, he came home as a national hero. But we have not yet built monuments to the women in our communities who have survived control and intimidation and violence levels that don't exist even in prisoner of war camps. The women that Itır was referring to in Rwanda, but also the women who live next door. Well, I don't have time to go on. Maybe we'll cover some of this later. But what in the workshop tomorrow or some of our other discussions. But what I did want to say, and in closing, is that we are now coming to appreciate that the primary harm involved in domestic violence is not the threat to your physical safety and security, but the primary harm involved in coercive control is the basic harm to our liberty as full persons and our inability to operate as full persons. The success we've had in the United States is in part and worldwide in bringing this issue to government attention. Now I am keeping you from lunch. The success we've had is not the result of the fact that we are so strong. We are, and we were dramatic in our protests, and our issue was just. But the success we've had is based in large part on the fact that if women are not free and full and equal persons, the country is diminished. The economy cannot thrive. If women cannot contribute to the economy to their fullest by imagining themselves and projecting those imaginations into the workforce and into the economy, the country cannot thrive. So on the one hand, we talk about extending human rights to personal life, women's right to association, their right to independent decision-making, their right to dignity and respect, which is as fundamental a human right as the right to be free of physical pain, and their right to equality and justice. But we also have to understand that the most fundamental right that we're talking about is the right to personhood. I'm going to end just with one, maybe I will. I just want to end with this and make this statement clear to us all. When we started taking on domestic violence, we had many allies in the community who weren't feminists and didn't really believe in women's liberation, but understood that it was wrong to hit women. When we take on coercive control, what we're doing is we're rewriting the story so that our focus shifts from men hurting women physically to domination itself. And once we open the conversation about domination, because we invite an entirely new set of allies to the table, and we lose many of the allies that may have been sitting with us before. But to do justice to the women in our community who are experiencing these crimes, we have to acknowledge and really come to terms with the level of the oppression they're experiencing. You cannot even imagine this oppression unless you imagine women as full persons. But once you imagine women as full persons, you also understand that this cannot be tolerated. We cannot have a society in which one population, as our famous president in the United States, Abraham Lincoln, said, is half slave and half free. The government would like many governments, not just this government, but all of our governments, who get so much of their support from upholding the values of patriarchal families and domination. They would like nothing better than for women to be free and equal in the workplace and to contribute as voters and to remain slaves at home. And right now, and the reason domestic violence is on the rise in Turkey and coercive control is on the rise around the world, is because women are caught in the middle. We are saying you are formal equals, but we are unwilling to give them the full equality without which they can't defend themselves and survive and escape. We are saying they can be free to contribute to the economy, but as soon as they come home, must serve a different master. That cannot survive. So whether you're students or fellow scholars, I invite you to engage in the activism it takes. Now, of course, one solution is simply to get rid of the free part of the equation. To say if women are half slave and half free, let's kick them out of the economy, let's kick them out of the political sphere, let's kick them out of the culture, and let's send them back home to do what they did so well, and we'll have peace at last. But anyone who's married to or going out with or is themselves a woman knows that we will not stand for this. My daughters will not stand for this. My wives will not stand for this. My mothers will not stand for this. My sisters will not stand for this. The only option then, obviously, is a level of activism that brings the system to terms with the reality of women's lives and their right to full personhood. And unfortunately, my final message is a fairly negative one, which is that freedom is not free. That this is not a fight that we can engage in without recognizing that there are going to be terrible consequences to those of us, men and women, who engage in this battle. But as I tried to say in my opening statement, there are a few joys in life worth living for, and I'm at an age now where I'm getting ready for the other side, the next life. There are a few joys in life that are better, that are greater than setting people free and living in a world which is a better place than the world we entered. So this is why we invite you and engage you and support those of you who are already dedicating your lives to this, to stay with us in this fight. Thank you.
Yes? Okay, yes, now we're on. All right, now we're running a little behind, but I didn't want to cut you off because it was
I appreciate
definitely a very interesting talk. I think we can probably take 10 to 15 minutes of question and answers, but we have another session that's going to be beginning at one point. So what I'd like to do is maybe open the floor to questions.
I'm sorry I went over, but I could have talked much longer.
You put two New Yorkers in charge, and this is what happens. All right. Yes. Any questions?
They all agree with me.
All right. Well, I think I'll use my privilege as the host of the event to ask two questions. The first of these questions is, why do women even stay in these relationships? And two, is any man capable of using coercive control?
Well, the answer to your second question is yes. Every man is capable of using coercive control. In my family, the reason I ended up going to social work school is because I used to come home and point to things on the floor. And I would say, how did that get there? Equally stupid things. And my family had a meeting to which I was not invited and decided that I had several options. And going to social work school was the best option that I had. But the reason every man is capable of coercive control is because coercive control is not rooted in the quirks of individual masculinity. It's rooted in systems of sexual inequality, which grant men privileges, time privileges, sex privileges, even though they may seem small to those of us who have them, that are greater than what are afforded to women simply because we're men. And coercive control exists. Look, women in the United States at least hit men, and as you saw, kill men at many of the same levels that men hit women. But women are not abusive to men in the same way because they don't have the privileges that men have. They can't draw on the resources that men can draw on. So only women, primarily women, end up being victims of this system of domination. And it's very important that you understand this, that this is not about victims and offenders. It's about systematic inequalities, racial inequalities, gender inequalities, sexual identity inequalities, which play out in the use of privilege to dominate. So the answer is yes. The question about why women stay, I've tried to answer from the standpoint of women. First of all, there's no evidence they do stay. By stay, you mean remain within the family in which they are being physically abused. Virtually all women that we know in this business leave, and leave multiple times. But the two things I want to leave you with on this are, first, that leaving and staying don't end the abusive relationship. So whereas outsiders may think that leaving is a solution, for women themselves who are being abused, leaving is simply a tactic within an ongoing process of extricating themselves. But the other thing that you must know is that the problem for those of us who've been working in this area for many, many years is not why women stay, but why men stay. Everyone understands who's been in this business that we can hide women out, we can move them to other communities, we can change their names, their locations, and within days, sometimes within hours, if he has electronic surveillance equipment, he will find them, and they know he will find them. So it is, even when they're divorced, even when they're separated, they continue to disrespect the boundaries of personal life in ways that are absolutely prohibitive. And what I've been asking you to do is to just project yourself. These are not women's rights we're talking about. These are human rights we're talking about. But because women are not fully recognized as human, because they do not have the full and equal personhood of men, they're being exploited and can be exploited and diminished in ways that men cannot. So the answer, obviously, is full equality. And fighting in and it means that women's liberation, which probably is an immediate cause of some of the violence and abuse we see, because after all, if a woman is completely obedient and completely subservient, he only has to hit her, as biblical law used to say, once in a while, just to keep her honest. But it's only when those controls do not work, and women's liberation is on the agenda, not just in the media, not just in the economy, but in the home, at the dinner table, in the bedroom. It's only then that he begins to recognize that he needs to exercise levels of extraordinary control which diminish and hurt and even remove from him the very person that he supposedly started out loving. And that's the point at which we begin to intervene and say, the problem is not too much equality, the problem is not enough.
Okay, so I think we can just take one question because we're running behind. Okay, yes, and if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Dragos Matescu from the Department of International Relations, this university. I'm from the Balkans, from Romania originally, and I have to ask a question about spaces. I offer you the case study of a certain gentleman called Socrates and a certain lady called Xanthippe, his wife. He had to run away, and he decided that is a proper solution, and he establishes mythically the public space of politics, at least in our minds. She remains dominant over the private, supposedly. Are we still in the middle of this, and this is the question for you, of course, in this paradigm shift from private to public that we cannot come to peace with, and we cannot, and we shouldn't actually divide, and about the paradigm shift that I think is still relevant. Could you please comment on that?
Yes, this is a very important question. If I can put the question in my own terms, he's asking the question of, have we come to a point where private and public intrude so much onto each other that the distinction is no longer important? And my answer is absolutely not. That what women are defending when they defend their space in the homes, if you notice, I didn't use the term private, because historically and philosophically and in the history of liberal political theory, private has meant property. And to men, the private space of the home was the space in which the woman was part of the property that he inherited. And this is even true of feminist liberals like John Stuart Mill. But I use the term personal space because it is in personal space that the political philosopher Drusilla Cornell talks about what she calls the imaginary domain, where people are able to go backstage in their lives and think about their possibilities, imagining themselves sexually and economically and politically in ways that they cannot do in the public sphere. So that I think, and women value the personal space. Some women who do stay, and stay out of love. And you say, well, how can she love a man who hurts them? Rather than saying, isn't it incredible that the capacity for love extends to people who do us harm? I mean, after all, this is, in Christian theology, the very centerpiece of what we believe. And this can only happen in personal space. But I think we need to, at the same time, get rid of the idea that the personal space is a private space. I think that to protect because in civil law, as you know, including Greek law, private meant free of the need for law. You know, Locke believed that you didn't need to regulate violence in the home because violence would not happen in the home, because since men were so naturally superior to women, there wouldn't be any conflict. Whereas in the marketplace, where people conflicted as equals, there would be violence and you have to regulate it there. So civil law has classically stayed out of the personal life and kept the understanding of rights out of personal life, except where it overflowed into the so-called public sector of civic life. I think what I'm saying is that personal life is in jeopardy today, and therefore needs a vigorous defense by the state. But that defense cannot proceed by excluding the personal, but by very carefully negotiating, building from indigenous networks of women and men who support them and families, the kind of personal spaces in which people can survive. One quick other thing. One of the things that happens in almost all coercive control relationships is that women develop what we call in our movement safety zones. They find diaries or secret objects or drawers or bits of clothing or pictures, however small or however other relationships, in which they believe they can think about their options and make healthy choices outside the abusive relationship. We call them safety zones because they're carved in the small pieces of everyday life. And the abusive man goes on what I call search and destroy missions. He tries to find those diaries, go through her pocketbook, root out her emails, go through everything until he has closed off the personal space. So the answer is not to collapse the personal space into the public, but to develop a notion of personal rights and personal space that is not bound by the classic liberal theories of privacy. And this is what many political philosophers, Salah Ben Habib, and many others, and Drusilla Cornell, have been trying to do in their work. And it's certainly a challenge that we invite your participation in as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we're